Good afternoon, everyone. Please feel free to continue to get pies and refreshments, but welcome to the TA instructor panel on how digital literacy impacts teaching and research, a dual program for instructional excellence teaching workshop and an event part of the FSU Digital or Critical Thinking Symposium. We're happy to have you all here, and thank you to whoever's logging in on the live stream. Happy to have you engage that way. I'm Sarah Matheson. I'll be one of your moderators today. I'm a third-year doctoral student in art history. Specifically, I study the Eastern medieval world. I'll turn it over to my co-moderator.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Franklin. I'm also a PI Associate along with Sarah, and I'll also be helping moderate today. I'm a third-year PhD student in musicology, so that's a lot of fun. I'm currently teaching one of the music appreciation classes, so it's been fun for me to work with this panel and brainstorm different ways to use the digital in the classroom. I'm looking forward to implementing some more of those ideas myself, and we're really excited to have such a lovely panel here. We will be talking about the digital experience, how you can use digital tools both in your own research and also in the classroom. So we have 4 lovely people, one of whom will be joining us shortly, that have great experience with this. They're going to share some wisdom. We'll have time for them to talk about themselves and their own work a little bit in this area. We'll have some case studies after that where we can kind of dig into ways that we can use these ideas ourselves. We'll talk about limitations, and there will be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to our lovely panel, starting with Sarah, Stanley, if you're good. All right. Yeah, if you'd like to. And you can grab that mic or use this one. Either way.
I'll use this one. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Stanley, and I'm the Digital Humanities Librarian at Florida State University, so here, obviously. So a lot of people ask me what digital humanities is, and I honestly don't know. No one really does. That's an eternal conversation in the field, and actually it gets a little bit tiresome to talk about, but I guess for the purposes of today's panel, digital humanities is basically using digital methods, whether it be large-scale text analysis or data analysis, data visualization, and applying it to humanities research objects, so literature, film, art, et But then there's also a flip side of that, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, or a little bit later in one of the hands-ons. It's also applying humanistic methods to technologies, so basically talking about what are the implications of technologies. Of course, there are a lot of different fields that are doing this, but what happens when we use algorithms to search for things, how does that shape our world and shape how we make knowledge? So that's most of what I do every day, and that kind of plays out in a few different ways. I help out with faculty and student projects. So I help people kind of grapple with what it means to use digital tools in their research and what tools work best for their particular research question. So I do a lot of consultations in that area. But I also do a lot of digital literacy instruction. I do workshops, which I've actually recognized some faces from workshops that I've taught in the past, but on digital tools and methods, and that's kind of where the digital literacy comes in. How do certain tools impact how you're analyzing research objects, and how do you actually use tools effectively and honestly in your research?
Hi, everyone. I'm Britt Hunter. I'm a 4th-year doctoral candidate in art history. I work with Sarah Matheson. So I do, much like Sarah, I use a lot of, obviously, fine arts and humanities as well as digital tools. In my own research, I actually am a manuscript historian. I work on illuminated and illustrated manuscripts of the Middle Ages, which we don't have a whole lot of here in Tallahassee. So I have to rely on, of course, digital objects to access these materials, like most of us who work on historic objects and sites do. And a lot of them, actually FSU Sturgeon Library has digital, am I talking too loud? Has digital book readers similar to these things. So the British Library is a great one with a really great magnifying tool. A lot of these digital readers for book objects simulate turning the page. So those of us who really lament the lack of or print culture that seems to be going by the wayside these days. So we include that in teaching as well. Some of the things that we do in art history as well overlap with other disciplines. So this is a project that I've worked on in the past. DEMR, the digital editing of the medieval manuscript roll, it's actually run out of Yale University. It's this initiative that they're trying to text encode. That's what TEI, which Sarah can talk to you more about. The text encoding initiative, creating digital facsimiles and digital objects of these non-digital objects. And then some other things that we do that pertains to my research is one of my ambitions is to do data visualization through GIS, the graphic or geographic information system, and how linking these historic physical objects to spaces in geography and how to visualize that and how that impacts research. So things that we do in the classroom, however, are sometimes a little bit more basic. You don't have to have coding skills to keep these things in mind. Everyone in here uses images in their teaching, right? One thing that we do in art history is we have to keep in mind that these are three-dimensional things that we have to convey a sense of reality and spatial reality of. So just keeping in mind a sense of scale, being cognizant of the way that we present two-dimensional objects, the flat images on the screen, and conveying a sense of scale to our students who can't really experience them physically. We do that through videos as well. I'm sure everyone already uses videos in their courses, as well as online courses, especially to create a sense of physicality of an object. And immersive experiences. So there's plenty of these types of objects. The Vatican Museum has a really great digital immersive, it's not quite VR, but it simulates what it's like to be inside. This is the Sistine Chapel, and it's got this really great nauseating back and forward, and you can click and scroll and move around. Those are some of the things that we specifically emphasize in art history, as well as I'm sure other humanities disciplines already use a lot. Some things that FSU Art History is exploring right now is the use of photogrammetry to create three-dimensional objects online. So hosting a digital object in some kind of repository to extend access to these objects that are in the museum to students that are not either in, Tallahassee or to people that aren't even part of the FSU community. So how do we create, using photogrammetry, which is a process of stitching together numerous photographs of a single image. This is also really important for archaeological sites and architectural sites. So creating that sense of experience of an object. And then the other things that we're doing in the art history department are engaging in current events. This actually ties into what Sarah Matheson and I are going to talk about a little later as far as keeping digital media and digital literacy in mind for assignment building. So this is our very own Kyle Killian, who's a professor of art history, who was interviewed in the news at the time that the Notre Dame Cathedral burned down last year. I hope you all cried with me. And then virtual reality is taking that step further. So things that don't actually exist today, how do we recreate what is lost to history? So it's not just a matter of recreating the physical object that we don't have here, but recreating that physical object that doesn't even exist on the world anymore. So those are some of the future aspects that we're looking into and some of the things that pertain especially to our art history department on campus.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. My name is Katie Kelly. I am the current PI Graduate Student Program Assistant here at FSU. I'm also a final semester student in the Instructional Systems and Learning Technologies program over at the College of Education. If you don't know what ISLT is, that's okay. A lot of people have no idea, and it's a little intimidating when you look and see the title is about this long. But ISLT is essentially a field that is not industry specific, because no matter what type of field you're in, no matter what industry you are pursuing, there is some sort of element of learning and performance. So my field addresses a lot of the learning and performance problems that can arise in various organizations, schools, things like that, and we focus on analyzing and coming up with instructional and non-instructional solutions to problems in learning and performance. And a lot of those can take the shape of digital tools and other types of technology, things like that. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit specifically about the roles of an online instructor. I previously served as an online TA as well as an instructional design intern on campus, so I've had the opportunity to both work as a facilitator in an online setting and as a designer in an online setting. We'll also get into some of the distinctions between online instructors and a traditional face-to-face instructor, as well as some of the tools that you have access to as students and in some cases as employees here at Florida State University. So our agenda comes in 3 parts. First, we're going to discuss the various roles of an online instructor. Next, we will explore the theoretical and practical applications of each of these roles. And we'll close things off by going over a few of those digital tools I mentioned that you might find very helpful when you are working in your classroom. Oops. Before I get into this conversation, I'd like to pose a question to all of you. What do you think are the roles of an online instructor? What kind of tasks or responsibilities might you have if you are teaching in a digital setting?
So the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is going to be grading. Is the number one thing is grading, but also providing outlines and guides to help your students through work that they're predominantly going to be needing to do on their own.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, and that is actually one of the major elements of one of the roles that we're going to talk about today, because in a face-to-face setting, you're typically seeing your students, 2 times a week, 3 times a week, and you can give them frequent feedback, answer questions in real time, things like that. So making sure you're clear on your instructions and the types of evaluations and feedback you're giving them in the digital realm is very, very important. Throughout my time in the ISLT program, as I've mentioned before, I've had a great opportunity to study a lot of this information about online pedagogy. And I've also had a lot of misconceptions cleared up for me personally as I've gone through this type of content. One of the most frequent misconceptions I often hear is that a face-to-face course can simply be converted into an online course. In most cases, this is just simply not the case. There usually involves some sort of element of redesign in order to make sure that your students are getting a high-quality experience in an online environment and that they are properly supported in that environment, because again, it is very different compared to a face-to-face classroom. Additionally, I've heard some students comment that online courses are easier iterations of the face-to-face courses, and that they are entirely self-sufficient with no instructor involvement whatsoever. And again, this varies depending on the type of online course you're teaching. You might have something that is a lot more complex than a couple of online modules with auto-graded post-tests. For the course I TA'd for example, Theories of Learning and Cognition, the participation requirement alone each week was a week-long discussion forum which required students to participate on 3 separate days each week, and they had to respond to prompts as well as engage in conversation with their peers. So this is something that is very, very challenging for the students, and it also does require a substantial amount of moderation and evaluation by a TA or an instructor of record or a professor, depending on what type of role you have in your online classroom. And lastly, not all online courses are completely 100% online. Some of them do have face-to-face portions where they do more interactive, intensive work, and in that case, we have a hybrid course. When we do get into this conversation about online pedagogy and all of the elements involved in it, it can get a little bit overwhelming, particularly if you have not had much experience in this type of context. And one thing that I found really helpful when I was studying my online pedagogy course is a lot of the studies and models that are out there to help us build this framework and understand how this learning environment differs from typical face-to-face and some of the unique needs that your students will present. This article in particular provided a framework for my online teaching philosophy. It's called Exploring 4 Dimensions of Online Instructor Roles, a program level case study. If you're interested in reading it, you have access to it through the FSU Library database. And in general, the project was interested in exploring student and faculty perceptions of online course roles. And the framework they developed at the end of the project divides instructor roles into 4 broad dimensions. These dimensions are very applicable across disciplines and topics. They're not completely exhaustive. You might have a few more or a few less depending on your unique teaching setting, but they do give us a really helpful foundation to consult when we're trying to figure out how to design our online courses or plan how we are going to be a facilitator in the digital learning environment. I've divided each of these roles into 2 components, the theoretical concepts and practical applications, to cover both the conceptual nature of each particular role, as well as some of the real-world actions that you would take as a TA or instructor of record or professor to fulfill that role. The pedagogical role here has probably the most overlap with traditional face-to-face courses. This involves your mastery of the course content itself, as well as your skillful implementation of learning activities and assessments that are going to foster that critical thinking and achieve higher levels of learning among your students. So a couple of the things you can do to achieve this role include staying updated on your content and all your resources, trying to steer away from just lecturing and relying on rote memorization, and instead, asking your students critical thinking questions, even in a digital setting, and guiding them through the material, really getting them to think critically and reflect on their understanding of that content. And lastly, really no matter the type of learning setting you're in, whether it's digital or face-to-face, we want to make sure that the materials, activities, and assessments are all falling within alignment. If you've never heard of alignment, this is a major tenet in the realm of instructional design, and it encompasses the idea that your learning materials, your activities, tools, assessments, everything in the course shows a clear connection to your overall learning objectives. So, in other words, if you were to, for example, have a learning objective that states students will be able to list the major psychological theorists, then you would want to make sure your materials that you provide help students to achieve that goal, and that you have some sort of assessment item that directly measures that. Again, this is important no matter what type of class you're teaching, but in the online world in particular, where you don't have that constant face-to-face interaction, it's really crucial to make sure that everything is aligned and students see that what they're doing, the work they're doing, and the assessments they're being given do achieve those learning objectives. Oops. The second role is the managerial role, and this one is very intrinsic to good online course design and facilitation. It covers the logistical aspects of your online course, such as proper learning management system organization and maintenance, clear directions for your expectations of your learners, and consistent moderation of the course activity. In this role, you'll want to make sure that you are being very clear in all your instructions and guidelines and expectations for your students, since, again, they can't talk to you face-to-face quite as easily. So you just want to make sure that you are guiding them through the process, particularly if you have learners who are not as familiar with thriving in a digital learning environment. Additionally, you always want to make sure that any links or files you have in your Canvas course site are functioning properly. Sometimes some browsers like to freak out and block everything that you're trying to get your students to access. So, reminding them of that, making a note of that can prevent a lot of technical difficulties that can happen. And lastly, making sure that the material itself is organized in a logical manner so that students can find it will help the course to run a lot more smoothly. As the name suggests, the technical role has to do with the technology in your course. Namely, you want to make sure that whatever tools you use, they support your learning objectives and achieve alignment. You also want to make sure that all technologies you use in the course are fully supported. And by this, I mean, according to the best practices in online course design and facilitation, you want to make sure that you link to tech support for any tools you use in the class, to accessibility statements for learners with diverse needs, as well as privacy statements so that students know how to operate safely with whatever tools you are having them use in the course. When you are deciding on what tools you'd like to use to facilitate your learning activities or your assessments, it can be helpful to keep something called the technology acceptance model in mind. This model encompasses the idea that user acceptance of a particular piece of technology depends on their perceived ease of use of that technology and their perceived effectiveness of that technology. In other words, your learners need to feel like they are supported and given ample instructions and support for that tool that they're using. And they also need to see that alignment between the course objectives and the tool itself so that they know they're not just using technology for technology's sake. It is going to help them to achieve your learning outcomes and be successful in the course. And last but not least, we have the social role. This one encompasses the rapport you build with your students and the steps you take to establish a learning community in the digital environment. I know a lot of people cringe when they see the word icebreaker, but there are some really fun ones out there. For example, one online instructor I had students make slides on a Google slide that we all had editing privileges to, and they were able to put pictures of their hobbies and their career goals and all types of things. And just little activities like that at the beginning of the semester helps remind students that they are part of a learning community, even though it's digital, even though they may be on totally separate continents, that they can make those connections with their peers and with the instructor. Additionally, you want to make sure you pay attention to whatever your particular audience is. Some of them need a little more scaffolding and guidance when they're getting used to the online forum. Others may dive right in and they won't need quite as much support, and that really depends on your unique group of learners. And lastly, it is really helpful to employ check-in techniques and frequent feedback throughout the semester, and that just reminds students that they know their instructor or TA is there, they know that their progress is being monitored, even if it's something as simple as, hey, you're doing a really good job. That really helps to prevent students from feeling isolated when they're operating in an online learning setting. At this point, I'm going to wrap up by just quickly listing some of the tools that you have access to as TAs at FSU. I'm not going to go through the whole list for sake of time, but this PowerPoint will be available, so if you're interested in looking over any of them, you can find them at the PI website. So Canvas is FSU's current learning management system, or LMS. This is where the majority of those roles will be satisfied. If you are curious about some of the more advanced functions of Canvas and some of the things you can do with it, you should have free access to lynda.com, which has a lot of really great tutorials. And I know I used it when I was a TA operating through Canvas, and it really, really helped me with setting up the learning management system and figuring out how to do things like grading and marking attendance and things like that. Flipgrid and VoiceThreads are really good alternatives to presentations in your course. Flipgrid only allows you to record about 5 minutes. However, students can either do a webcam where you can see their face, or they can upload a PowerPoint and talk over it. And their peers can go online and give webcam commentary on the presentation, which is really cool because it lets them see their peers' faces and see their reactions to the presentation, and it kind of overcomes some of that digital divide that they may be experiencing. VoiceThread is very similar. It does not allow for webcam integration, but you can make longer recordings. And students can go into their peers' presentations and they can comment on specific slides throughout the presentation, either through audio or through text. So this is interesting for when you have those longer presentations that are more analysis focused or critique focused, things like that. Canva is a really awesome tool if you want your students to create any sort of media. This is what I use to make all of the Pi social media banners and flyers and things like that, and it's completely free and easy to use. And lastly, if you have any sort of tests in your online course, there is a lockdown browser app integrated into Canvas, so that will limit your students' internet activity while they are taking the exam. If you're interested in any of these tools, you will probably need to fill out a request for through IT, or the professor in charge of the course might need to do that if you're a TA, but you do have access to all of these really, really awesome tools, either as an employee here or just for free. But that is the end of my presentation, so I am going to hand it off to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I think that was a great introduction to how you can create a functional and engaging classroom on an online platform, and digital platform, as well as some good digital tools that students can use. I think right now we'd like to jump into a quick discussion of some of the limitations that we as TAs and faculty members experience in the classroom using digital tools. So I'd like to open it up to our panelists to talk about what they've experienced as TAs and how they've seen students either struggle using navigating digital platforms or digital tools, and how they are able to teach their students how to navigate these things, as well as any larger limitations they've faced. I know we're speaking right now from the privilege of being at FSU and having institutional access to a lot of these tools, so maybe we can open it up at the end to what can we do outside of FSU, especially once our students move on from Florida State. So yeah, I'd like to open it up to our panel to start this discussion. What are some limitations that you guys have experienced in the classroom? You guys need a mic?
I guess I'm starting. Hello. So this feels kind of like a cop-out to that particular question, but one of the things that has been kind of emerging in my field is this concept called minimal computing. There's this kind of understanding that a lot of digital resources, especially in the humanities, especially if you have like you're loading these like beautiful big TIFFs of like pieces of art or something, in certain areas they're just not going to be accessible. And so that's actually been a movement to kind of like minimize the technologies that we're using so that things are more accessible on mobile, things are more accessible when you have kind of shoddy internet connections. So there have been kind of these moves away from like database-driven websites, which can be very hard to load and they're very bulky, to something that's a little bit, it's more like a static site that has minimal HTML and calls in, images, and it loads easily. It loads when you're on mobile and, maybe on data instead of on Wi-Fi. And so I think that I just kind of want to underline the importance of this question, which is that, like, especially when students leave, we really need to be thinking about how to make technologies accessible to people. I know there was the whole thing about you got one of the things from the FSU library databases, but then of course, as soon as you're not a student, all of those that database access goes away. So I think it's something that we really definitely need to be talking about.
One of the biggest problems that I've encountered with trying to build online courses through Canvas and things like that is making sure that all materials in this digital setting are accessible to learners with diverse needs. it can be a very, very intensive process because you need to go through and make sure that all of your text follows proper guidelines, images are appropriately labeled, you have closed caption settings and scripts for any videos you use. So I think increasing awareness of practices and accessibility and all the different, even just the basic guidelines could be really, really helpful for overcoming that barrier and helping us to all increase how accommodating our digital classrooms are to learners with diverse needs.
Hi, I haven't had a chance to meet you yet. I'm Sarah Eyerly. I'm an associate professor of musicology over in the College of Music, and I think I'll get a chance in a little bit to introduce you to some of the things that I do in my research and teaching involving digital methods, but they basically are at the intersection of geospatial research and sound studies. And so when I've been trying to introduce those types of projects and technologies to my students, one of the biggest barriers has been my own knowledge. You can't know everything, and you don't have time to retrain as a specialist in all sorts of different technologies, in addition to the fact that those change so quickly. So I think one of the most difficult things is just gathering enough expertise as an instructor to be able to introduce, even at a very basic level, some of these ideas and technologies to students. I used to teach at a private liberal arts college, and there was this wonderful academic computing center there that was just geared toward teaching. So basically, if there was any technology, including actual equipment that you wanted to use in your classroom, they would buy it for you and they would figure out how to train you on it. So there was just a whole team of specialists who were geared toward helping with that type of instruction. And I think that is one sort of piece that's kind of missing here at FSU, which would be really a wonderful part of our teaching infrastructure and training to be able to add both for graduate student instructors and also for faculty members.
I would like to echo the sentiments of my colleagues in a lot of the ways that we try to reach students digitally, but also to reiterate that sometimes students have very minimal experience. I have a student in my class right now who's a non-traditional student. She's coming into college after a very long career, and she is banging her head against the wall trying to figure out how to use word processor, which we take for granted as graduate students at FSU is something that not only do we get for free from the university, but also we have experience in using these formatting tools and just submitting things through the LMS the way that we've been doing for a number of years. So what I've tried to do in my class is to build in some time when I'm describing the assignment to also describe how to do the assignment technically. So not just what I expect from you in your paper and what things I want you to cite and what you should be addressing as far as the prompt, but also how to simply access these technologies, because it's hard to say where in their career or where in their education they are and if they've had those like tutorials from the library or from whomever. I'm constantly surprised on how much I take for granted. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but it has been a real shock this semester.
Just to kind of go off of that, yeah, because it's always surprising. I mean, one of the things that kind of frustrates me the most about how we talk about incoming undergraduates is we refer to them as digital natives because they happened to maybe grow up with cell phones. Like, oh, okay, they should just naturally know this digital technology, but that's usually not the case. A, not everyone has equal access to these technologies, and then B, phone application design is so much different than any computer technology that you're going to be using. And so getting beyond just kind of like, oh, I know how to use WhatsApp, or like, oh, I know how to use Snapchat, like those are designed to do usually a limited number of things. And as soon as you need to move on to technologies, it becomes a lot more difficult. And the other thing too is with proprietary apps, like a lot of what you're paying for is ease of use, like point and click functionality. So I sit down with students who I figure will be like raring to go, like we're gonna get down to the command line, we're gonna type in some commands, it's gonna be great, we're gonna like convert files like with one just like fell swoop, and they're like, oh my goodness, it's hacker typer, like I can't do this, I'm gonna break my computer. And so I think just, not assuming that everyone knows naturally how computer technologies work is really, really important for equalizing access.
Yeah, going off of that same note, that's another reason why a lot of best practices in online course design and facilitation, it's important to link to tech support. And in a lot of cases, I suggest to link to tutorials for how to use every single piece of technology you use, particularly in the digital classroom. Even if it's something as simple as Microsoft Word, it helps the students to, not feel embarrassed by having to come to you and say, I don't know how to use Word, in your case. And it also helps you as the instructor to have to spend less time playing the role of tech support and instead helping them with the content. So that's just one tip to kind of help with that kind of thing.
I'll just offer some advice from my own experience too, thinking about the gap between one's own knowledge and what you actually want to teach students to do. Think about your network, all of the people that you know and the different skills that they have. There are very likely to be people with skills that could be beneficial to your students. So one of the things that I did when I wanted to teach a doctoral seminar that was very much based on digital methods is I found 5 or 6 different specialists in the various types of methods that I wanted to teach about. I maybe had some cursory knowledge in each of my own, but each of these specialists came in and did intensive workshops as part of the class or went out into the field with us to teach us how to do recording, to teach us how to do sound design, to talk to us about ArcGIS and doing sound mapping. Or, there's most likely people in your circle or network that could actually help. And I would encourage you to think about the idea of collaboration. And that's one possible way to solve this conundrum of not needing to know everything, is that everyone has a little bit of knowledge, and put together those can be tremendously powerful for your teaching and for your students.
So speaking of collaboration, have any of you experienced limitations of technology and would like to share that experience? And we can kind of open it up for a brief discussion of that before we move on to our case studies. Go ahead. Would you like a here?
So I'm probably loud enough without that, but okay. Well, so my experience has been that the document and tutorial everything is not an online thing at all. I started out, I was teaching 19, and now I teach a lecture class of 140, and if I do not demonstrate on the screen, on Canvas, in student view, before there is an assignment, exactly where the assignment is, about a tenth of my class will pretend that they don't know how to find the assignment. Some of them, in fact, probably genuinely do not know, and this is something where there's a baseline expectation that you can navigate Canvas at least a little to the tab labeled assignments by the time, it's spring semester, at least, maybe. I don't know. My question is this. I have an actual question. I'm not just complaining. How do you balance the amount of digital technique it seems like we need to teach to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind in how to do the basic parts of engaging with schoolwork here at all without swamping what we're actually here to teach? How do you work on that balance?
Sorry, I just turned this off for a sec. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. That's kind of, again, goes back to that technological role that I was talking about to all of you. One thing that can help is to just have all those tutorials that you find, whether it's through the university or just on YouTube, available for anyone to watch, how to use Canvas, basics of submitting assignments, basics of navigating the university LMS. If you want to address it in a face-to-face course specifically, one thing you might consider doing is, as part of your first day attendance activity, actually going through and briefly showing them how to navigate through your particular Canvas course site, because even if they have had a couple of classes at FSU, a lot of them do tend to look different and be organized differently in the LMS. And that will just give them a quick face-to-face overview, and then adding that plus having those resources like YouTube links for quick Canvas tutorials might kind of help some of those students who may genuinely be struggling. And for those who are pretending that they don't know where the assignments are, that can kind of cover your back as well, and so that they know they have the resources to show them where to find the things they have to do in your class.
I think that's an excellent question, and an issue that I'm obviously struggling with is how to balance, because my job is to teach the history of art. It's not to teach you how to use word processor and whatever. So what I've found so far in experiencing this is that I'm willing to meet you at some level in order to compensate. So if you cannot wrap your head around submitting aspect of it and turn it in and all the things that we're asking them to do in Canvas, then I'm willing to meet with the student one-on-one and say, okay, fine, just email it to me. Because my job is to get your assignment. So I think you're right that we do need to empower the student that, like, find the information yourself. That's what we're all here to do. That's how we're teaching them to research. Why not teach them to train themselves in technology as well? So I'm trying to encourage that. And then, like you said, it's like, why can't I just tell you Canvas? Why do I have to spend 5 minutes out of my lecture to show you Canvas? Especially when you stare at a sea of faces and you say, you guys know where this is, right? And they just nod. And you're like, then why don't you submit it that way? So I think what I've been experiencing with is varying degrees of leniency. So if I have a student who's really, really across the digital divide, then how do I get us a little bit closer? And then how do I not waste the time, or at least not maximize the time of the other students? Do you find that in your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a second half to the question, which is, okay, so that's like the tools to use to take our class. But then I think, this kind of relates to what you were talking about with site design and stuff. I find that in terms of using outside resources, there's a lot of almost learned helplessness. Like, you can't tell people, oh, go look this up and tell me what you find in a lot of situations, because what you'll get is the first result on Google from everybody. In order to teach critical thinking, which I get is the theme today, right? In our courses, it seems like we have to teach them how to be critically proactive digital citizens, and that's an entire separate job from all of our courses. So I struggle with that part of the balance too, not just, okay, how much time do I spend teaching them how to use Canvas, but how much time do I spend teaching them how to use the internet correctly? Because apparently, like, we're the sweet spot for knowing that in some weird ways. I have so much anecdata from my department about this that would waste time, but it's like,
I guess I would encourage thinking about the problem in a slightly different way. If we think about many of the courses that we all teach, part of the mission is to teach critical thinking, and a lot of the time that happens through written communication or skills in written communication. And so even though our field might be art history or music history, and we're trying to get the students perhaps to write about some particular topic, really what we're doing is teaching them the craft of writing, and writing is an actual process of thinking critically about things. And so it's the same for digital technologies, I think, that the pedagogy of teaching them is actually part of the process of teaching people in your field. It's part of the work that we do as teachers in our individual fields. It is really no separate from how we teach writing as a method of critical thinking. If we just expect students to know how to write and we're just concerned about the topics that they write about, that it really isn't going to work very well, even at the graduate level. And people's, even me, I'm still growing as a writer, and I still really, need to think about that process critically. And I think digital pedagogy can be built into a class just the same way.
I have a bit of a shameless plug. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Deso. I am the Digital Literacy and Modern Languages Librarian at Strozier. This is actually a big component of my job. If you are incorporating technology into any of your coursework or any of your pedagogy, I am available to help consult, to develop assignments, and incorporate trainings into your classes or develop workshops for your students so that they are able to successfully navigate the tools that you need them to use to complete the assignments for their class. I am happy to consult with you to answer those questions and develop those assignments and try to lower the barrier of entry to students successfully completing these assignments just from anxiety of having to pick up and learn a new tool or technology. Jonathan Deso, D-A-S-O. You can find me on the library website.
Yeah, Jonathan. Go see Jonathan, he's great. So I think the other thing, just kind of going off of that, and just building on your point, I think it's not just writing that I guess we all have to teach, but also just information synthesis. And I think that's a really challenging thing when we have a K through 12 system that prioritizes having the right answer right through various standardized testing. So, I mean, and it's hard. Like, this isn't giving you an answer in any way. I'm just throwing more complications in there. But like, it is really hard when we are using tools like Google, which are privatized. And I'm actually going to be using a Google thing in a minute when we do one of the sample assignments. But we've kind of offloaded so much of that onto private companies. And I think it is important for us as instructors to, whenever we can, call attention to that and be like, oh yes, we are using Google Scholar, and here's how the algorithm works as far as we know. It's private, but like, I think it does at a certain point, even if we are teaching in various disciplines that have nothing to do with computer science and nothing to do with algorithms, to like really call attention to how we are letting those machines do thinking for us. But.
Okay, so if you want to think of more questions, great. We're going to move to some case studies so we can see how these lovely people have incorporated some of these ideas into their classes, but feel free to bank up your questions for the end as well, because we'll have a question time. So if Dr. Eyerly doesn't mind starting, since she didn't get to introduce her research yet, I will pull up a few things for her, and you can just tell us about how you've incorporated the digital into your research in the classroom. Either way, whatever you like.
Maybe we should look at the coastal soundscapes first. Okay. So I have 3 different examples of working with students on digital projects. Again, these relate to sound studies and music studies because that's my field, but I think some of the ideas here could be applicable across disciplines. Last fall, in the fall of 2018, I taught a course that introduced students to various digital methods in music scholarship. It might seem like kind of a conundrum that if you're studying music, maybe you should consider incorporating sound. But usually people just write about music and they attempt to try and describe sound in words. So my whole, bent as a scholar is to actually use sound and sound design and musical performance as a way of communicating scholarship and ideas, which is actually something kind of new in our field, surprisingly. And so one of the projects that the students and I did was a sound map of the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. We had the help of a recording technologist, a wonderful recording engineer who comes for a residency from London twice a year in the College of Music. He went out into the field with us in September of 2018. We chose to represent different coastal environments that are part of the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. You can see them named here by their mapping points. pine flatwoods and ponds, a hardwood swamp, black needle rush and cordgrass, salt marsh, coastal plain, pine and cabbage palm forest. These are some of the different coastal environments that you find as you wind your way through the refuge. So we chose particular GPS points or stopping places to record very basically ambient soundscapes of the natural environment there. Students took some time just to kind of be in the environment and to listen carefully, not only to the sounds of insects and birds and other types of wildlife that are in that space to kind of learn about that environment, but also the ambient sounds like black needle rush and cordgrass make a beautiful sound when the wind kind of goes through them. So it's also about teaching students to kind of listen a little more carefully to the environments around them. We didn't know this, but there was about to be a hurricane after we went out for our original visit. So at first we thought our map was going to tell the story of the long history of this place, going all the way back to Panfilo de Narvaez and his disastrous expedition through this part of Florida in the 16th century and coming forward into the present day, sort of a historical look back at this place and the people who had come through it. But we ended up telling the story of the hurricane and how that impacted the sound environment. So we were able to go back after the hurricane and kind of observe, given a similar time of day, a similar temperature profile and so forth, had that actually affected the natural environment in those places. So our mapping points include journaling by students of the things that they observed and heard on the visits that we made, and it also includes different soundscapes that were recorded by students as part of this project, and also descriptions of these different environments. Another project, can we put Moravian soundscapes up there, that I've done involving graduate students is a much larger sound mapping project that goes along with a book manuscript I was writing that reconstructs the sound world, the sonic history of Moravian mission communities, Delaware and Mohican, German, English residents living in these mission communities in eastern Pennsylvania during the period between the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. And so several graduate students were deeply involved in this project. We did 2 years of field work in eastern Pennsylvania, collecting the geospatial information and also designing the soundscapes that would go into this. There are no sounds that survive from the 18th century, so we created what I like to call historical soundscapes. So that was a way of kind of teaching digital sound design, similar to how you would create a soundtrack for a film. So absolutely, this is, even though this happened outside of a class, it's still a really important teaching component of what we do here at FSU, being a part of a research program of a faculty member, kind of learning on the ground through, collaborative research, how these sort of things work. And the last project I'll show you also involves students here. This is a large digital article that includes film and also sound recordings. It tells the story of a single hymn, which you can see there in the center, a hymn written in Mohican that is from the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And students here at FSU assisted me in recording it in a sort of 18th century version, basically what we could derive from the performance practice of this hymn based on archival records. And then to sort of represent the idea of archival silence, or that the voices of the Mohican spiritual elders in the community who created this hymn and who it was very meaningful to are basically left out of that archival record. So we worked with a modern day descendant community in Wisconsin, and also Bill Miller, you can see him down there, to do 2 other recordings. Bill is a Mohican singer-songwriter. We worked with a church community on the Stockbridge-Muncie Reservation to record this hymn 2 additional times to bring a kind of Mohican voice back into the project. And students were very involved in all parts of that. They weren't involved in creating the digital site itself, but they were very involved in the actual sound scholarship that went into it and the reconstruction of the hymn itself.
Okay, so now if we could move to, do you want to move here? Okay.
Yeah, I think our case study perfectly addresses how to engage students and how to teach them to critically think and engage with information and scholarship. Britt will help me co-present this one because it's an art history example, but we chose this particular exercise because we think it is applicable to every field. It essentially deals with current events and current disagreements within anyone's field. One of the active debates in art history is over the Parthenon marbles. If you don't know what the Parthenon is, it's a 5th century BCE building from ancient Greece. In the 19th century, the British took some of the marbles back to England with them, and then they sold them to the British Museum where they now reside, leaving the building itself, the antique Greek building, split across nations in museums. And the debate is, where do these marbles, these cultural artifacts, actually belong? Do they belong in museums scattered around the world, or do they belong with the culture that technically produced them? So, Greece built its own museum in direct response to this problem in order to say, we want the marbles back, and they belong in the native, quote unquote, native landscape that they were produced. So the museum is actually built right below the actual site of the Parthenon, and you can see what remains of the Parthenon here on the Acropolis right beside the museum. Yeah, we got a pointer. So current museum practices, current national identities are being engaged in this debate over cultural artifacts. And Britt and I designed this activity to get students to learn about this artifact and how to engage with scholarship and popular noise about the debate. So I'll let Britt introduce it a little bit more.
Yeah, so we've designed a two-part assignment because we want one group activity, oral presentation, how do you communicate your stance verbally to your colleagues, and how do you teach yourself, essentially? And then the second part is dealing more with persuasive writing in a public-facing medium, which is not always something that we teach as educators, how to engage your field with the public. So it's an op-ed style written assignment. And by the way, this is an assignment that we're currently workshopping that has seen different iterations. So if anyone has input, we'd love to hear it. Yeah.
All right, so the first part of the assignment is actually assigning the students. How do we communicate this clearly to them? So not only do we put it up on the PowerPoint, but I have physically split them into two groups in the classroom. So left-hand side over to the left side of the room, right-hand side over to the right side of the room, and assign at random which side will be which side of the debate. So you guys over here would be pro-Greece, pro-return of the marbles to Greece. You guys on my left would be pro keeping the marbles in the British Museum. That way the students also somewhat physically model the debate format that we're gonna take in the next class. We then assign the group a starter kind of research packet, links that we want them to start with to start their research, so that they're all starting at the same point and engaging with the same scholarship and popular media, but then can expand from there to do their own research.
And this is really where the digital literacy comes in, as if we're providing them access to the online, news media, the popular media that they, you scroll through in your news feed. How do you take that and take a critical eye to that? It's your information literacy skills and your digital literacy skills to go out and seek that popular information and to supplement it with what you've learned in class with your more academic secondary sources.
Then we actually assign the assignment, which their homework is to craft a persuasive argument, defending their side, even if on a personal level they disagree with their assigned side. And they must prep this before the next class, because in the next class we will actually hold a mock debate. They will be divided onto their respective sides, and they'll have to present their argument as a group, and then respond to each other. So this engages them in not only with scholarship and examining and critically thinking about scholarship, but how to talk to each other and actually argue, and argue respectfully, but also using evidence-based conclusions.
Oh, and then part 2 is taking them out of the dreaded group work and putting them into the preferred solo work, and that has to do with the op-ed style article. So that's conceptualizing how do you put your own voice into what you're doing. It's reiterating the fact that a thesis statement has an argument in it. So just taking that and pushing it all the way into an op-ed where you're really prioritizing your individual perspective. So reinforcing those kind of writing skills at the same time as reinforcing the digital literacy skills in terms of conceptualizing how this type of writing style is disseminated nowadays. So it's personal and it's public facing. So how do we take what we do here in the ivory tower and communicate to people outside of your own discipline and outside of your own classroom, et cetera. And it's a shorter writing experience. It's not like your 10-page paper. It's condensing all of your thoughts down. So we've tried to, with this assignment that we'll continue to revise the more we teach it and use it, but we've tried to hit on a bunch of different aspects. Oh, thanks. A bunch of different aspects and definitely incorporate that more digital information media, and we'll show you some examples as well. So the key here is you don't have to stay on the side, if you're pro-British Museum in class, you don't have to write your pro-British Museum whatever. It can be whatever, side you agree with, or even if you want to take your argument, not to the Parthenon marbles, but if you want to talk about some other kind of indigenous cultural heritage that you feel very strongly about. So we're trying to develop that sense of personal identity as well as that sense of really, ability to argue in the humanities, which is so important.
So here are our learning objectives. We've found that it's important to tell these students the learning objectives in order to give them this sense of responsibility as well as control over their own learning experience. So Britt has kind of touched on each of these, but I think this slide, it's important to show them these things so that they can also live up to these expectations. They know exactly what they're striving for. So real quick, we'll walk you through the the research starter pack that we provide them with. Real quick, we provide them with the museum websites. That should be where they start to see how and if these museum websites address the debate, especially since this is such a nationalistically and identity-driven debate. We then pop out to more news-driven information. So all of these are news outlet publications. So The Guardian, ArtNet, Business Insider is the most recent one as of this Tuesday. Brexit is now coming into effect the debate. So we asked them to think about how nationalism or biases are affecting which view is presented or how it's presented in each of these cases. A lot of time they get excited about Amal Clooney because they know her as the wife of George Clooney, but we go, she's actually an incredibly successful international lawyer who has argued in this very debate. So it's another way of engaging their kind of popular culture sense and their knowledge in ways that they connect it to academic material.
Yeah, and these different news media outlets also address language. So in academic writing, we tend to write very formally, and sometimes we use these news media sources to highlight the really emotional and sometimes manipulative way that authors are writing and how to teach that evaluation skill for the students. So some other sources that we're including here, the Stuff You Missed in History class recently did a two-part podcast on the what they call the Elgin marbles. We call them the Parthenon marbles sometimes. And then the National Geographic website also has a video. So we want to include these multimedia because we're cognizant of the fact that not everyone learns the same way. So sometimes people really appreciate that oral experience. It drives home like learning if they hear it versus if they read it versus if they see it. So just a plethora of different sources, as well as this is getting into that more popular consumable history.
And then to continue with the assignment after the assignment is actually turned in, we found that it's important to link it to further reading type examples. And these examples can be those different types of medias, video-driven, podcast-driven, but things to get them to continue to bring this type of critical thinking and activity to stuff on their own outside of the classroom, away from us as instructors. So that is our art history example, but we think any type, Ben, you already spoke. What is your field again? Sorry. Philosophy. So, okay, yeah.
We're capped at about 20 for our survey. Yeah, I don't see. Oh, really?
Yeah. So the class size.
I don't think
will
we want
vary.
140 students arguing either. So, agree.
But I'm sure, do we have a STEM person in here? Is
Yeah.
there a debate currently in your field, potentially? No?
There is, so I'm Abdullah. I'm in the math department doing a PhD in math. So there is this small debate on how to basically treat math, you know. I mean, for the humanities, many people probably know that, you know, the debate that either math is discovered or invented, you know, that has been stepped aside as philosophical now. But there's another debate that's currently raging is how you actually treat math. Is it an axiomatic system, right? Or is it an art system? Like, do you just write out ideas or do you systematically go through them? So that's a current debate that's raging.
So I think this system could be extended to other disciplines, not just the humanities, to confront the very disciplines that they're engaging with in that class. So it works on a variety of levels for them. So yeah, time for the third one? Yeah, so we have one more case study, if you guys will bear with us before our question and answer period. And I'll turn it over to Sarah at this point.
Okay, hello. I'm gonna just stand up right quick. All right. Engrams, please. Okay. So if you happen to get this handout, you can, if not, you can get one on the way out, but it just says text data in class activity. I kind of gave away the game. I can't really do any fun things that I would normally do in class. Normally I type things in and actually have discussion, but I figured it would be good for you to have the answers, like the cheat sheet for future reference in case you decide to do something like this in the future. But so whenever I teach text and data analysis classes, especially workshops, one thing that I like doing is kind of underscoring the importance of having good quality data underneath, because that's really going to impact any of the results that you have output. If everything is garbled nonsense, you're not gonna have very good results for text analysis. But it's also really good for basically kind of seeing how, like what underlies a lot of the data on the internet. And so one thing that I like doing is going to Google. I'm actually just going to move this so that I can move the mouse more easily. Going to Google Books, which supposedly has like everything digitized, right? You know, that Google has all the information you could ever possibly want, and then sitting down with students and kind of complicating that resource and talking about where are the gaps, what are the things that actually might be missing from this resource, and how is that shaping your understanding of literature or of the printed record. So the first thing that I do is I just go into Google Ngrams. You know, you can do what they've done here, which is type in some fun literary things, and you can see, oh wow, Frankenstein, very popular, very exciting. But the first thing that I usually do, and I say this on the sheet, I usually don't do it with this word. I choose a more fun one if the class is mature enough, but for our purposes, we are going to say fad. And we type in fad, and it gives us a rather boring looking graph, in part because I forgot to change the dates. You can actually change the range of dates. So I change it to 1600, and then there's that search lots of books. And now we see that there is a rather interesting trend here, a fad, if you will, that basically shows that throughout the 17th century and then into the 18th century, the word fad is really popular. Now, I don't know about you, but I did not think that the word fad was around in the 17th and 18th century, so why could that possibly be? For those of you who have not looked at the sheet, does anyone have a guess as to why that is? I will tell you. It is actually because there is that funky looking, if you've ever looked at like colonial pamphlets and it refers to Massachusetts as Massachusetts or whatever, that is called the long S, and it looks a lot like an F if you're a computer. And so if you type in something like fad, it's going to give you a lot of false positives because what it's really reading is the word sad. And when I said earlier that I did a more kind of R-rated version, you can guess what that is if we're talking about F words. But you know, if you have a class that can handle that and would find that funny, you can use that one as well. Some other quirks, though, that I like pointing out. I always need to look this one up. 02138. You know, I usually will type that in and ask the students, what is this? Like, what is that 5-digit number? Usually one of them figures out, oh, it's a zip code, which is very exciting. But if we look at this trend line, that's like a super, super weird trend line for a zip code. Why are we using zip codes in the late 18th century? Why is there that weird spike in the late 17th century? It's very confusing. And so usually this kind of leads to some discussion, and eventually I reveal, oh, it's the zip code for Harvard University. Harvard University has massive collections. They put in their library stamps their name and their zip code in a lot of different things. And what this actually kind of reveals is that Google Books does not have everything. If you look at that big dip in like what, 1920 to 1950 something, maybe 1960, that big drop off is actually the copyright date. And so suddenly things go out of the public domain and suddenly are under copyright. And then things start getting digitized again, probably Harvard University Press books, things that have that Harvard zip code in them. So what you're seeing here is actually not just an error in OCR, which is optical character recognition. That's the computer vision that gives you text from books, but it's also a gap in their collecting practices, right? Like they don't have all of the books that they're claiming. They don't claim that they have all of the books. They say lots of books, to be fair. But there are big gaps, and so we need to be mindful of this when we are searching something that's seemingly objective, right? Like Google Books that has all of literature, right? Like it doesn't really have all of literature. It's missing some things. The other one that I do just to kind of prove that this isn't just an error with like old books, like the long S one, is I type in this, and then I usually ask, okay, what word did I just search for? And not everyone has a good angle on that one. It's also very tiny, but usually they can see it a little bit better. And most of them are like, oh, it's it. It's the word it. I'm like, okay, why are we so excited about the word it in 1960? What happened? Like we suddenly, like, is that when thing theory was invented? I don't know. But yeah, and so the discussion continues. Usually one of them will figure out like, hey, that's a really, really weird scale of relative frequency for the word it, because usually it shows up more than 0.0024% of the time. Like that's a pretty common word. And then they're like, oh, maybe it's LT. Like there it is. That is actually what I typed in. I typed in LT, not it. And what happens with more recent books is that as sans serif fonts come into being, OCR gets tricked. They think, is that an L? Is that an I? I don't know. I'm just going to guess. And so it's just another example of like, even with more recent data, you do get a lot of weird quirks. And so this usually just leads to kind of a discussion of, how is this data quality impacting us in terms of like how we are seeing the world? If Google is a digital representation of the world, like what happens when we have these kind of gaps and when we have these mistranscriptions and things like that? What time is it? I want to make sure I'm not going over. Okay. Okay. I am just going to quickly show this. The one thing that I do also we also discuss about Google Books is the fact that like, okay, this is a great trend line, but you hover over it, like you can't do anything with that. It doesn't go anywhere. So usually what I show is like a slightly better version of Google Books, which is HathiTrust has a similar ngram viewer. It's Bookworm is what they call it. But like theirs here is creativity. That's what they show, and it starts in the late 18th century. But what's great about them is, and I'm sorry, I can't really see from that angle. If you click on any given year, it brings up all the sources that it's pulling from, so you can go in and see whether or not like the data is actually accurate, which is actually kind of fun because I've used this creativity example a few times. The other thing that's great about HathiTrust is that, and it's actually easier for me to see here, you can add multiple searches and then filter. So you can filter by publication country. So one thing that I like doing is, okay, creativity in the US, and then creativity in the UK, search, and then it gives me two different trend lines so we can see that they're different. And then we can go in and examine each of these. And I think if I recall correctly, a lot of these are like education manuals and things like that. But then, yeah, we just kind of talk about the best ways of making our data transparent enough that people know what to make of it, right? It's not enough to just kind of put out a visualization and say like, hey, look, these are my results. We need to provide context. We need to be honest about the quality of our data. And so usually that's a pretty productive discussion. But I am curious to kind of see, because this is very text heavy, especially for those of you who are in non-text-based disciplines, if there are like other ways of kind of working in the data gaps, like especially with metadata, but I want to make sure we also have time for more generic discussion, so.
Yeah, thank you. So we're gonna move into our question and answer period with our panelists right now. We designed this panel to speak to a large range of not only tools, digital tools that we all could use, but a large range of resources for you all to use after this panel. Hopefully you feel comfortable talking to one of our panelists after, or our Strozier librarian staff, but just an awareness of the many tools and peoples, the network that you could all tap into on these issues. So with the case studies, with our panelists, I'd like to open it up to you guys for any questions that you might have.
Yeah, so I have questions about the debate assignment. So one thing that in philosophy I focus on is primary source reading a lot and not the secondary source stuff, because that's a great way for them to find things that they will not understand and get confused. So I have a question about how you organized the debate. You gave them a lot of sources, and then you said you can use outside stuff, you have to use at least 4. How many people actually bother to look for outside sources in this design? Have you tried that and seen yet?
That's a good question. I had a student who was pestering me all semester long in the fall for more information, like week by week, what's going on now. So I think if it's something that, and not everyone cares, first of all, but you do, I mean, I've seen students really get invested because we're asking them to pick a side. Well, first we're giving them a side, and then we're letting them pick if they agree with their side, they want to change sides, do they want to find a new debate. I think as far as our assignments go, they do get much more invested. I mean, it's sometimes shocking how much they really do care when you ask them to care or ask them if they care.
And to speak to the sources that we gave them, none of these sources we gave them are longer than a 5-minute read, or maximum like 5 pages. So they're coming in with an understanding of the Parthenon through class already, so kind of that factual information has already been given, and all of this is very quick, popular style writing for them to engage with. So it's not, it's not designed to be a full research kind of commitment. It is meant to be a true homework, 1 week long homework assignment.
And it's supposed to be fun. We want them to have fun.
All right, so thank you all for coming, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. We hope you learned something and can take something away into your own classrooms. As always, please feel free to ask any of us any questions you might have. Have a good day.